Joining me now is Terry Weber. Terry's a certified social worker and elder care specialist with UK HR Work Life. Glad to have you on the show, Terry. Before we get into our conversation on taking care of our older loved ones, can you tell us a little more about yourself?
Hi, Jacob. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate this. As Jacob said, I'm a social worker with the Department of Work Life Elder Care Office, and I've been an elder care specialist here at UK for 10 years. During this time, I've also been part of the sandwich generation, a wife, a mother, and a daughter. I was caring for my father who lived with us. We were a multi-generational household, so I understand the challenges of being a working caregiver. So many people nowadays are working remotely, but I actually started working remotely 4 years ago when my family moved to Wisconsin. So now I live with my husband, our new puppy, and my 12-year-old cat, who's not so happy about the puppy.
Yeah, you've got a lot of good experience there that you can share with people as well, which I think is really great. So in the first part of our episode here, I spoke with Azetta Beatty about balancing work and being a parent, particularly during a time like the current pandemic that we're in. So moving into talking about caring for older loved ones, I'm curious, are there any commonalities that you see between parenting and elder care?
Good question. Parenting and elder care do have some things in common. The goal as both a parent and a caregiver is to maintain the health and safety of those we love. But I think that the aim of these two roles are quite different. Parents' goal is to guide their children into adulthood, whereas the goal of someone caring for an older loved one is to help them during the end part of their life's journey. So we have to kind of think of it as a spectrum, parenting on one end, elder care on the other, but it's two sides of the same coin.
That's great. That was something I think we sort of take for granted too. It's sort of sometimes that comparison that you get between children and taking care of pets as well. I think it sometimes can cheapen one or the other when they do have some similarities, but they're not always the same. And there's definitely are some differences between those. And it's good to highlight those and understand those differences as well. So we know that stress is universal then. At some point, we're all going to face it in some way, but the source of that stress and the level of that stress can really vary. So in the context of elder care, what is caregiver stress and what are the signs of it?
Well, as you said, stress is universal, so everyone feels it. And stress is that fight or that flight response we've all heard about. It's the body's reaction to an adverse situation, whether that situation is real or not. It's characterized by physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion. And for caregivers, it's often brought on by neglecting our own physical and emotional health. Sometimes we get so wrapped up in our caregiving responsibilities, we don't even realize what's happening. But if stress is left unmanaged, as you know, it can lead to serious physical and mental health problems. Stress means different things to different people. And what causes stress in one person may be of little concern to another, and everyone reacts differently. So for some caregivers, it's that constant demand of caring for another person. But for someone else, it's maybe that lack of boundaries between being a caregiver and being a spouse, or being a caregiver and being their adult child. And then for others, it's sometimes the unrealistic expectations caregivers place on themselves. You know, we all want to be everything to everyone, and that's just not possible. So going back to your question, what are the signs of caregiving stress? They're not unique per se to caregivers, but it's that feeling of constant worry. Waking up in the morning feeling anxious already about what the day has in store for them. It's feelings of being overwhelmed, not being able to cope. It's the inability to focus and to concentrate on a task. It's forgetfulness and disorganization. It's becoming easily irritated or frustrated or having a short temper. And some of the physical signs, it's eating more or less, or changes in your sleep habits. Stress shows up differently in everybody. And stress by itself isn't bad. But what's important is how we deal with it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that's kind of what I want to spend the bulk of our remaining time here talking about. Knowing that our listeners are really in different stages potentially of life and of caregiving, let's sort of break this down two ways. The first of which, let's talk about addressing caregiver stress while actively providing care for an elder loved one. And then the second one, we'll kind of touch on preparing for its possibility for those like myself who have not quite reached that stage yet either. So let's start with the caregiver stress while actively caring for someone. What's important for people in this situation to know?
Well, anyone who's a caregiver already knows how stressful it can be, period. I mean, caregiving is stressful, but managing this stress is important for caregivers' well-being because who's going to take care of your older loved one if you aren't able? Caregivers spend a lot of time thinking of and doing for other people, and that leaves little time for themselves. So I would say self-care is the key. It's not a luxury, it's a necessity. It's critical in being a good caregiver. But sometimes when you are in the middle of it, finding and taking the time for yourself seems selfish and indulgent. But it's not. We got to keep telling ourselves self-care is not a luxury, it's a necessity.
That's something that Azetta and I talked about as well, is the idea of the importance of self-care and taking care of yourself so that you can show up as your best for others. I mean, to not think of that as a selfish thing. And something that Azetta talked about that I'll kind of recap is it's an ongoing process. It's an everyday, all day process rather than these little moments in time where you may get a massage or something like that. And so I think you kind of touched on that point a little bit. I mean, I think what you said with, if not you, who? So I think you have to keep that in the back of your mind based on what you're saying, that is important, because if you can't take care of yourself and you can't show up for others, then who's going to take care of them? So it is not selfish. Mm-mm. It's the way that you can move forward and you can give your best as well.
That's right. Taking time for yourself, no matter how long or short that period is, just makes you more equipped for challenges of caregiving. It makes you more confident in your abilities and much better able to adapt and recover from setbacks. And believe me, there will be setbacks. But here are some things that I've learned over the years, kind of some strategies. One way to manage stress is to be active. Get some exercise is a great way to manage your overall well-being. It helps release those endorphins in the brain, which energizes you and makes you feel good. A 10-minute walk can give you time to think, to vent to yourself, or to simply have nothing else to do but walk. You don't have to talk with anyone, you don't have to listen to anyone, and you don't have to help anyone. And another way I found to manage stress is to eat healthy. Although this is where mindfulness comes in. You need to be very mindful about what you eat, and so it's easy to forget about your own needs when you're caring for a loved one. But avoiding all that processed food and excess alcohol and trying to eat a healthy diet keeps your energy up and kind of gives you a better outlook on life. And sleep. We can't forget sleep. Poor sleep can affect your memory, your judgment, and your mood. And if you're continually being sleep deprived, it can have all sorts of negative consequences. And I know it's hard, but maintaining a healthy bedtime routine can really help in getting a better night's sleep. Like we talked about, taking time out is another way to manage stress. And I know it's easier said than done being a caregiver. It can be incredibly hard to find time for yourself when you're caring for someone else. And even when you do, you're thinking about what you should be doing or could be doing. But spending time with yourself away from everybody else is time well spent. Remember, you are more than a caregiver. You're a friend, you're a parent, you're a coworker, and you hold all these different titles. Another point, I think, is give yourself some grace. We all make mistakes, and things aren't always going to go the way we want. Caregiving is hard, and when we're going through a particularly tough time, allow yourself some kindness. We're human. We can't do it all. Sometimes we wish our situation was different. But in the end, caregiving really for an older loved one is truly a noble thing. And finally, I really think staying connected with family and friends is super important. Surrounding yourselves with people that you trust and respect and with whom you can share your frustrations and sadness with helps you feel connected. Again, it's not selfish. It's essential. Elder Care has kind of come up with what we call the 6 tenets of caregiving. So if anybody wants to check that out, it's posted on our website.
We'll actually link to that in the show notes as well. I think you covered a few good points and things that I want to, again, highlight. Finding the things that work for you. This was something that Izetta and I talked about as well. And what are those things that help you recharge? So it may be different for different people. So trying different things and looking for the things that are going to work for you are really important. I think you also show the importance of focusing on your entire well-being, not just these individual segments of your well-being, like how nutrition plays into this and how sleep plays into this. These things are all interconnected. So if we can positively affect one, it may kind of chain reaction to the other. And so I think that gives us a really good holistic look at well-being. And again, sort of the idea of this podcast and having different topics each episode. And I think that was a good thread that you tied through all of those. And then there was a couple of points that you made that I thought were really great as well, that tie really well into the conversation with Izetta, which were being flexible is what it sounded like, applying some kindness, so some of that compassion as well, whether that be to yourself or whether that be to others who may be going through it. And then that connection piece. We talked about that as well, about how important that is to ask for help if you need it, but to sometimes just be there with people or to listen to people. Kind of having grandparents who have now all passed away, that's something I wish I still had, is that opportunity to be able to sit down with them and to continue to connect with them as well. So I think this goes beyond just the support of it and thinking about caregiving and how you want those final days to be. I think would be really important. So to not miss that connection with them and not think of it as just a job. Again, I'm kind of looking at this as an outsider, but I'm thinking about my potential future with this as well and how I want to approach it. And so that's something I just kind of wanted to bring up. So kind of speaking again as somebody who's not currently in this position, for those who are listening that are not currently taking care of an older loved one, what advice or tips would you give to them to prepare for caregiving and to help minimize some of the stress that often comes along with this?
Well, starting on all those things we just talked about maybe is a good start. But for people who are going to be potential caregivers, caregiving down the road, now is the time to get the practical things in place. And that's for both you and your loved one. So you need to talk about the future. Don't assume that you know what type of care your loved one wants, because you don't. Ask. Family conversations, no matter how difficult, are an important part of care planning. You and your loved one need to discuss these options. What would they like most and what is most realistic for everyone? And kind of going into the next point is, what can you afford? No one likes talking about money, especially a parent with their adult child. There are very real costs to caregiving, such as can your loved one afford to stay in their home and hire in-home care when they're no longer able to be independent? Or can they afford to move into an assisted or personal care facility? Remember, Medicare doesn't pay for these things. You need to find out what their finances are, where their finances are, and who has access to this money. And that kind of brings us into the last point, is to make sure that the legal protections are in place for both you and your loved one. Crises will happen. It is inevitable. You need to look over your loved one's legal documents. Do they have a living will? Do they have a durable power of attorney? Do they have a healthcare surrogate? And do they have a will? So when someone becomes unable to speak for themselves, these documents will ensure that their wishes for their finances, their health, their long-term care, and their end-of-life care will be known.
That's really important, talking about not assuming things and to have that conversation now. Again, thinking personally about this, how those legal protections and getting into things like living wills and powers of attorney and those types of documents that you have to have, that's a lot to unpack. So I think that really ties great into another question, which particularly for those who are working at UK, what resources do you offer through WorkLife for those that are either actively going through caregiving or are preparing for it in the future?
Well, the WorkLife Elder Care Office can provide support, guidance, and assistance in finding services to help you, no matter where you are in your caregiving journey, if you're just starting out or you're at the end. We offer monthly lunch and learns featuring experts from around the community talking on a variety of elder care topics. We also have a monthly support group, which I co-host with Ann Bassoni. She's one of the WorkLife Connection therapists. And in November, we always host our annual Senior Caregiving Conference.
So one of the other staples that I have that I always ask my guests, where can listeners really go a little further with these types of topics? What books or websites or any sort of resources that you recommend that would add some value?
Well, the book, The 36-Hour Day, is considered the Bible to dementia care. I think it's like 6th edition now, and it's been around for decades, but it is a must read for families caring for someone with Alzheimer's or another type of dementia. And the premise of the book is that there is a lot that can be done to improve the lives of both those living with Alzheimer's and those caring for someone with Alzheimer's. And I just finished a book not too long ago called The Last Ocean by Nikki Garrard. And I thought it was really good. It talks about what dementia does to both the person living with it and to their caregiver. And as for like podcasts or things like that, if you haven't heard Brene Brown, definitely check her out. She has presented on several TED Talks. She's written several books and has this great podcast called Unlocking Us. She talks on vulnerability, courage, guilt, shame, and empathy, everything a caregiver experiences.
Brene Brown's a regular feature in this answer.
I bet.
And finally, to kind of wrap it up a little bit, if you want listeners to take away one key piece of advice or one takeaway message from this conversation, what would that be?
I think that self-care is not a luxury. It's a necessity. You need to take care of yourself when you care for someone else.
Perfect. Very succinct. I love it. So I really appreciate you chatting with us today. And I hope listeners learned a little bit about the experience of caregiving, what they can do if they're currently caregiving, and what they can do to sort of prepare in the future if you're planning on having to do that. So we really appreciate you stopping by, Terry.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it.